Okay. So thank you so much, Olivia, for the introduction. And thank you, Kelsey, so much for the invitation to speak today. And of course, thank you all for virtually attending as well, especially on a Friday. I'm just going to just get my PowerPoint set up. And can everyone hear and see me or see the slides? Okay. Yeah, so hopefully I'm praying to the Wi-Fi gods that everything, my internet stays stable and everything. But anyway, yeah, so thank you once again for coming. The title of my presentation today is International Teaching Assistance and Accent Work. So this presentation is based on a journal article that I'm trying to write. And so I really appreciate, the opportunity, to translate my incoherent ideas in my head into something somewhat coherent, right, in the form of these PowerPoint slides. So yeah, so with that said, let me just first start off by giving a land acknowledgement. So where I am physically, I'm giving my presentation on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, part of what is now known as Southwestern Ontario. And as I was talking with Olivia, where I am specifically is in a city called Brampton, Ontario. So I know that land acknowledgements are performative in many ways, but I just want to use this land acknowledgement as really a reminder that concerns about so-called foreign accented Englishes in such countries as Canada are really the result of white settler colonialism that has led to the erasure and marginalization of Indigenous languages and cultures. So in the context of this talk, when we talk about the alleged issue of international teaching assistants or ITA's accents in Canadian universities and elsewhere, right, this is really an artificial problem, right? So no accent is inherently problematic. Certain types of accents are made to be problems, under certain socio-political conditions, right? Such as, white supremacy, settler colonialism, capitalism, and so on. Yeah, so I want to start off by just thinking about this whole notion of accent work, right? So oftentimes when we hear this term accent work, we connect it to the workplace learning of professional actors. So when professional actors have to play a role that has a speech accent other than their own, right? They're said to do accent work, right? So they might work with a dialect coach or accent coach, for example, to sort of attain this type of speech accent, right? So on the left-hand side, right, we have a picture of Eric Singer. So he's a fairly famous, dialect coach who does all of these, YouTube videos critiquing actors, portrayal of different characters and different accents. So in this sense, when we talk about accent work, right, for actors, it is very important because the way that you portray a particular type of accent can determine from the audience perspective, right, how well you perform as an actor, right? So if you have, like a fake, so-called fake accent, you're going to be perceived as, not authentic in your portrayal of a certain character. But when we talk about accent work too, we have to remember that other types of workers also engage in a type of accent work. So just using the example of, TV and movies once again, we can think about a movie like Sorry to Bother You, which is partly about, call center work, right? And so Lakeith Stanfield's character, who we see in the second picture here, right, one way that he sort of becomes successful at his telemarketing job is, adopting the so-called white voice, right? So he makes callers believe that he is this white, middle-class male caller from the suburbs. And because of this, he achieves more sales and he eventually, gets a promotion, right, in the movie. So accent work is important in this type of sense because it does really lead to maybe material rewards, right? So if people like your accent, like the character you're portraying on the phone, right, you can, increase your commission, you can get that promotion, etc. Yeah, so in this presentation, I want to argue that ITAs are yet another set of workers who engage in a type of accent work, albeit it's a very different type of accent work than an actor or, a call center agent, for example. Yeah, so as those maligned for the so-called incomprehensible accented Englishes in global North universities, ITAs have to engage in accent work to be able to be understood when teaching. So their accent work is not about, portraying a different type of character, right? Their accent work is really about mitigating this often racist, xenophobic perception of themselves, right, as language workers. So their accent work is really about mitigating negative perceptions about themselves rather than, trying to portray someone, trying to portray a character per se. But another thing about this accent work that I would say is that it's not really voluntary on the part of ITAs. I would say that this work is actually spurred by ITAs' roles as so-called service providers who must orally deliver commodified knowledge in neoliberal universities. So universities, right, under neoliberalism often present education as this private good to be consumed by students. And so part of this commodification of knowledge is, recognizing that teaching staff, including ITAs, have to orally deliver this knowledge, right, to students through, lectures, tutorials, etc. But if your speech accent, for example, is interfering with your intelligibility, and you also have to, and your speech accent is also part of, is also what you need to have, right, in order to deliver information to students, right? This accent can become a professional liability, right, for some people. And so you might need accent work, right? Might have to perform accent work, sorry, to, to sort of, make this liability go away, for lack of a better term. Yeah, so let me clearly state the purpose of my talk today. So drawing on the professional experiences of 14 ITAs working in various universities in Ontario, Canada, I want to explore what the accent work of ITAs might look like. So I want to show how this work is not performed in a vacuum. So when ITAs are performing accent work, they're both contesting and conforming to various ideologies of oppression at the same time. And I also want to think about how the accent work of ITAs can better ITA training. So this is something I'm going to explicitly talk more about in the second last slide of my presentation. Yeah, so just in terms of an agenda of what I want to accomplish, I hope to speak for about 45 minutes. Yeah, I forgot to confirm that with Kelsey, but I think that's correct. So the main thing that I want to do first is really think deeply about this notion of accent work and theorize accent work. So this is going to be the main chunk of my presentation today. So when we theorize accent work, I think, first of all, we have to understand accent work as a relational practice, first of all. And secondly, we have to appreciate the materiality of accent in accent work. So after I do this theorization of accent work, I'll talk about the methodology and participants I use to theorize this notion of accent work. And then after I do that, I'll talk about accent work as working on accent. And then I'll talk about accent work as working around accent. So both of these prepositions are important, and I'll explain what their significance at the appropriate time. And then finally, to conclude, I'll just offer some general thoughts about accent work. And like I mentioned before, I'll talk about the implications of this work for ITA training and how to better ITA training. So let's first start off by talking about theorizing accent work. So I think theorizing accent work entails understanding accent from multiple perspectives. So I think first, like I mentioned in the last slide, we should think of accent as, a relational or oppositional practice. So an accent is always done in relation or opposition to something else. Another thing that we have to note is that there is this sort of material quality to accent. So even though we know accent is relational, the way that we talk about accent suggests that we perceive it as, this type of thing that we possess, that we can shape, that we can mold, etc. So let's first start off by talking about accent work as a relational practice. So the first thing that we have to note is that, accent is always a relational construct. So really an accent becomes an accent when juxtaposed with that of its perceiver, right? So when we're talking about speech accents, for example, right, a speech accent only really becomes a speech accent, right, in relation to the listener's own perception of the accent, right? So the listener will sort of assess or determine what is or is not an accent based on the listener's own, accented voice, for example. But the relational nature of accent is also seen in terms of performance. So as scholars like Cutler notes, people make a variety of phonological choices about their speech accents. Quote, in order to highlight aspects of their identities and interaction, signal degrees of alignment with other groups, and shape how others see them. So when we think about accent as a type of performance, right, we can begin to think of accent as a type of work, right, in terms of effort, right? So if we want to manage impressions about ourselves, if we want to engage in any type of identity work, right, an accent becomes a type of work, right? It becomes something that we have to sort of put some effort into in order for us to sort of display a certain type of identity to our interlocutors. But when I talk about accent as a type of work, I'm also saying that accent is actual work too. Accent is paid work, accent is exploitable work. And I think an infamous example of this is, so-called transnational call center work. So as many of you know, right, we have, call center agents in India and the Philippines, for example, having to sort of neutralize their accented Englishes in order to be understandable for callers in the global north. But the thing to remember about this type of accent work is that this work is not really about linguistic accommodation on the individual level. It's also about accommodating to larger systems and ideologies of oppression. So if we think about the Indian call center worker, for example, having to talk to someone in the UK, right? So there is a sort of neo-colonial relationship happening through accent, right? So the Indian call center agent has to sort of neutralize their accent, which is often a euphemism for maybe making themselves sound more like a British speaker of English. And they have to sort of, cater to the customer needs of the UK caller, right? So through accent training, right, call center agents are sort of reinforcing or having to reinforce these neo-colonial relationships between the global north and the global south. But when we talk about accent work too, it's not just about conforming to systems and ideologies of oppression. Accent work can also be oppositional at the same time. So scholars like Eustace note that linguistic pride may override organizational requirements concerning speech accent, right? So even though workers might have to, are forced to maybe adopt a particular type of accent for their job, right? They don't have to completely conform to this, right? They can maybe be subversive in some sense by keeping certain traces of their accents, right? For their own, sense of identity, right? And for their own sense of pride, right? So even though accent work is, exploitative labor, right? Workers do have some sort of agency in kind of, sort of maintaining some, some aspect of their accents. Okay, so we've talked about accent work as a relational practice. I think we also have to appreciate the materiality of accent in accent work. So basically, from a folk linguistic perspective, accent is often given material qualities. So from a folk linguistic perspective, we often think of accent as this type of thing that we each have, right? So just a simple way to understand this point is just to think about the different expressions that we have for accent, right? So we might say that someone has a thick accent, someone has a heavy accent. We have expressions like losing an accent. So I remember Trevor Noah, the comedian, in one of his comedy specials, right? He has this bit where he talks about, the illogical nature of actually losing an accent. Like, how do you actually lose an accent, right? Do you just like misplace it and then you can't find it, right? So through these sort of ludicrous types of, expressions we have about accent suggests that, we do treat accent as this type of thing that is sort of tangible in a sense. But I think one thing that we have to note about the thingification of accent is that it can be so strong that entire industries can be built around it, right? So one infamous example is the so-called accent reduction industry. So as its name suggests, right, accent reduction suggests that accent is the stable, coherent thing that can be reduced or made smaller over time. The example of accent reduction also highlights how accent can be a type of goal. So something to learn about and something to work towards, right? So in the US context, for example, accent reduction providers might say, hey, you can learn a so-called American accent in 30 days, right? So in that sense, right, the American accent is this sort of tangible goal that you're trying to strive towards, right, through the process of accent reduction. So that's just another way of how we think of accent as sort of this material, thing. I think also an accent can be highly personalized by acting as a unique accessory to flaunt. And so to make this point, I think we have to think about accent as being akin to something like hair, right? So just like we might style our hair, for different occasions, right? We might style our accents, right, in unique ways to communicate different messages about ourselves, right? Similar to Cutler's point about accent as performance. So like in a job interview, for example, or a presentation, I might make my hairstyle more formal, for example, right? In the context of accent, for example, right, I might, in the same job interview, I might want to sound, more professional, more, formal. So like we can sort of treat our accent as something that can be, modified to our own unique style, right, depending on the situation. Yeah, and so then I think one final aspect of the materiality of accent is how it's actually perceived as an obstacle to overcome. So, for example, while Crease and Cambere detail how an accent can be a so-called border that African immigrants cannot fully cross when looking for work, Zhang notes that that an accent can be a thing that, quotes, gets in the way, right, during oral communication and must be addressed by the accented speaker. So Crease and Cambere note that, in the context of Canada, right, a so-called Canadian accent, which is ideologically tied to the white settler colonialism of the nation, is actually used as a border, right, that prevents certain types of racialized immigrants from fully accessing, employment or being able to fully attain meaningful, well-paying employment, right? So for African immigrants, the Canadian accent is really a mechanism for anti-Black linguistic racism that they face in the labor market. Zhang also talks about accent as a barrier, but in terms of everyday communication between ITAs and their students. So when students sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so when students are unable or unwilling to, understand the accents of ITAs have to, take the responsibility of making sure that their accent doesn't cause miscommunication, right? So maybe ITAs, if they can't change their accent, they might, use nonverbal tools to communicate the point, right? So they might use PowerPoint slides, for example. They might use diagrams. They might use board work, etc. Okay, so I think understanding the complexities of accent work means examining the multiple stories told about accent, as well as how people are positioned in these stories. So for this reason, I believe that a narrative positioning analysis was appropriate for analyzing how ITAs describe their own accent work. So this presentation, like I said, is really about theorizing accent work. So I'm not really going to go into detail about my methodology. All I will say at the moment is that the type of narrative analysis that I was doing was looking at how people position themselves on 3 different levels, right, in the act of storytelling. So for Bamberg and other narrative scholars, right, storytellers often position themselves in one of 3 ways, right, in the act of storytelling. So on the first level, they might position themselves as characters in the story, as actual protagonists in the story. On the second level, storytellers are, this level of positioning on level 2 is really about storytellers positioning themselves in relation to their audience. And then the third level is really about how storytellers draw on master narratives, ideologies in society in their storytelling. So like I mentioned before, I'm not interested in giving you a detailed narrative analysis of the examples I'm going to show you in a little bit. I'm just going to be talking generally, just in terms of accent work. So but if you have questions about the methodology or whatever, I'm happy to answer talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. Yeah, so I think to explore ITA's accent work, I drew on interviews with and journal writing from 14 ITAs working in universities in Southern Ontario. So these participants ranged in age from early 20s to 40s and all identified as so-called non-native English speakers. So 9 of these ITAs were from STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math fields, and the rest were in the social sciences. So in terms of how they classify themselves, weirdly enough, the ITAs often describe themselves in these broad geopolitical terms. So oftentimes they describe themselves as Middle Eastern, Latin American, Asian, or African. And so this isn't to say that they didn't always identify with a specific ethno-racial background, but oftentimes they just use these broad categories. And just for the sake of maintaining their privacy, I'm just going to refer to them by these broad categories as well. And then one final thing to note about the participants is that they all spoke at least one additional language beyond English. So they all identified as bilingual or multilingual. Okay, I just need some water. Okay. So I've talked a lot about accent work, but let's actually look at some examples of what accent work actually looks like with regard to ITAs. So I think one aspect of accent work that we can look on is this idea of working on accent. So the ITAs told stories about their accents being professional projects that they needed to work on in their daily communication with students and colleagues. So while some of these projects treated accent as a learning goal, others highlighted how accents can be these sort of personalized creations. So I'm going to show you an example of accent as a learning goal, and then I'll show you another example of accent as this personalized creation. Okay, so let's look first at accent as a learning goal. And to do so, we're going to look at this story provided by Jasmine. And Jasmine is, of course, a pseudonym. All the ITAs have pseudonyms in this presentation. But basically, Jasmine is a Middle Eastern engineering TA. And oftentimes in our interviews, she talked about, learning to sound, quote unquote, sound native, right? When preparing for her tutorial sessions. So I'm just gonna read an example of this, and then I'll talk about the significance of it after. So she says, one time I had this word that I couldn't pronounce. It was azimuth. So I got a native English speaking friend to tell me the correct pronunciation. Sometimes you need to check with trusted native speakers because there are some national or cultural differences in pronouncing words. I don't trust the pronunciation from Google Translate. And then she briefly laughs. Yeah, so this story, is kind of, mundane. There isn't really anything particularly interesting about it. But when we think about it a bit more, it does reveal something significant, I feel, right, in terms of language. So in this story, I think that Jasmine both contested and reaffirmed particular ideologies about language. So while her joking distrust of Google Translate refutes, the neoliberal view of language being this neutral tool for communication, which is, devoid of cultural meaning, she actually advances ideologies of nativeness by suggesting that native speakers are the natural arbiters on what constitutes proper pronunciation. Right, so when she talks about, there are some national and cultural differences in pronouncing words, right? Jasmine is saying, we have to understand language from it in its sociocultural context. But by doing so, she's sort of reinforcing this ideology of nativeness and saying the only people who actually know how language is authentically used in particular contexts are these so-called, native English speakers. So once again, it's interesting that, even though she's resisting this neoliberal view of language, the way that she resists it is to, rely on another type of ideology of oppression to do so. So this is just like a broader example, a specific example of the broader trend of how when we talk about resistance, right? Resistance is not the polar opposite of oppression, right? Oftentimes there's this dialectical relationship between resistance and oppression, right? So the way that we resist certain things is actually to embrace other types of oppressive, ideologies. Another thing that we have to note about Jasmine's story is that she focuses on sounding native in terms of her words, right? So she's focusing on her pronunciation of words like azimuth, right? And I think this really highlights that Jasmine is not really interested in changing her entire accent. And I think this quietly speaks to her working in the context of engineering. So many of my engineering participants in my study talked about how in engineering oral communication, students and faculty, whoever, aspiring engineers are often encouraged to sort of speak quickly, concisely, precisely, right? So they're not expected to talk on and on and on about their feelings and about whatever topic, right? They're supposed to just say what they have to say in as few words as possible. So I think with regard to Jasmine's own learning goals, right, to sound like a native speaker, right, I think this is really tempered by this communication convention in engineering, right? So she's not interested in changing, the super segmental features of her pronunciation, right? She's not talking about intonation and rhythm, for example. She's really just talking about, segmental pronunciation or the pronunciation of specific words, right? So it's interesting how, the professional culture in which she's situated can maybe sort of limit how much she wants to sound like a native speaker of English. So that's just something else that we should, take note of. I think other engineering ITAs were similar to Jasmine in the sense that they wanted to sort of limit their accent work in certain ways, but their reasoning for doing so was different, right? And one such example is seen in this exchange that I had with another ITA named Alejandra. And she was in Latin American engineering TA, and she talked about how wanting to have, a hybrid accent, a so-called hybrid accent. And this is, talked about in detail in this exchange that we have here. So I'm just going to read it for you like I did before, and then I'll comment on its significance like I did before as well. So I first asked her, so like having an understandable accent, does that mean having a native or native-like accent? And she responds, I would say yes and no. I feel that you can still have your accent, but still be understood perfectly. So I think it's more in terms of words, like if they sound similar to that of a native speaker, but you can sound how you are when pronouncing sentences. It's more like, and she pauses for a couple seconds, and then I interject, just taking some elements. Yeah, taking some elements, that's right. So I guess you're developing like a hybrid accent, like you still have your Spanish intonation and rhythm, but the pronunciation of specific words would sound native. Yeah, I don't want to forget where I come from. So I think it's also about keeping a sense of identity, like being recognized as Latina. Okay, so I think what's noteworthy here is how, my questions and interjections help to craft Alejandra's understanding of her own accent work, right? So when she has this, brief pause about describing her accent, oops, sorry, my interjection about just taking some elements really helps her to sort of, make her accent work more concrete in her mind, right? So she really understands what she's actually doing with her accent. But I think our discussion about, taking some elements once again speaks to the influence of engineering, right? So it's not only in the sense that engineers are just focused on, the precise pronunciation of certain words. I think it's also about how engineers view the world as well, right? So engineers often are interested in creating order from chaos. And I think it's interesting how they might apply this to language and specifically accent in particular, right? So when we talk about, just taking bits and pieces of different types of phonological aspects of English and Spanish, right, we're sort of suggesting that, the accent and language is sort of something that can be neatly built and modified in these concrete ways, like if we're building like a type of robot or something, and we can create this unique creation of an accent. So it's interesting how we have this sort of mechanical type of notion of accent, right, in terms of how we perceive of a so-called hybrid accent. But just once again, I think the main purpose of Alejandra's accent work is, to retain her identity as Latina, right? So although her job requires her to be understandable, right, she can be understandable in her own unique manner, right? So she doesn't have to sound completely native, like Jasmine, for example, right? She can sound Latina, and that's perfectly fine. She can still get her job done, right? There's no issue, right, with this. Okay, so we've talked about accent work as working on accent. Another type of accent work is working around accent. So it was also the case that the ITA spent effort into lessening others' preoccupations with their accents. So this type of accent work involved either explaining or supplementing accent. So like I did before, I'll give you an example of explaining accent, and I'll give you an example of supplementing accent. Okay. So to talk about explaining accent, I want to share this story from an ITA named Frederick. And Frederick is an African health sciences TA. And part of his accent work was really just explicitly addressing the alleged problem with his accent with students on the first day of class. And so this is exemplified in this story here. So he says, when I come to speak to the class, I'll tell them that I talk fast and have an accent. I tell them to stop me at any time and ask me to explain something again. So I tell them that murmuring is not allowed because I know sometimes they are murmuring while I'm speaking. I basically tell them, okay, I have a terrible accent, which you might be perceiving now. However, if I talk too fast, raise your hand and ask me to slow down. When I'm excited about a topic, I tend to talk fast about it. So I basically tell them that this is who I am. I tell them this ahead of time. They should tell me directly whether they're not understanding instead of murmuring with each other, trying to figure out what I said. Okay, so there's quite a bit to talk about here. So I think the first thing to remember is that Frederick, really wants to present himself as someone who's unwilling to anticipate student misunderstandings of his accent and act accordingly, right? So he doesn't want to be on pins and needles trying to figure out when his accent is going to be a problem for students. He wants students to take some responsibility in their communication with him and just be forthright with him when they don't understand something he's saying, right? So he wants students, to actually openly negotiate meaning with him, and he wants students to sort of help themselves, right, in terms of understanding him by letting him know what he needs to change about his accent if necessary. But while Frederick is not interested in changing his accent, right, it's really up to the students to tell him what he needs to change. I think Frederick's use of double voicing actually suggests that he's somewhat influenced by the racial linguistic ideologies pitted against him. So if we look back at what he said, right, when he tells students, that was, okay, where was I? Yes, okay, so when he tells students, okay, I have a terrible accent, which you might be perceiving now, right, this type of double voicing suggests that, Frederick is kind of internalizing this idea that he does have a terrible accent in relation to his students, right? But one reason that we have to understand, one reason why he might have said this is because, Frederick is really, the racial and linguistic outsider in his department, right? So he is one of like a handful of racialized so-called foreign accented speakers in his department, right? Most of his faculty and students and colleagues are white native English speakers. And so because he is sort of physically and orally different from his workplace context, right, we have to consider maybe this is sort of, making him insecure about his accent in the sense that he defines his accent as terrible. So even though he wants students to know who he is through his accented voice, his voice can be positioned as terrible because it's juxtaposed with the voices of his students and others in his university. So, I'm not trying to say that Frederick, is this sort of, oppressed, like, sorry, academic worker, right? He is displaying resistance by saying, hey, I'm not going to change my accent only if you tell me to, right? But it's interesting how he understands his accent. Like he's still trying to, empathize with students, alleged problems with his accents by labeling it as terrible. So, yeah, once again, it's just complex, right? I'm not sort of praising Frederick. I'm not saying, Frederick is, this sorry worker. I'm just saying he is a complex being, right, in terms of his own accent work, right? So he's displaying resistance, but he's also, sort of accepting this idea that there is something deficient, allegedly deficient about his accent. So Frederick's accent work is about, explaining his accent to students. For an ITA like Johnny, his accent work is about, supplementing his accent during oral communication. So Johnny is an Asian computer science TA. And in my interviews with Johnny, he talked a lot about using gesture to supplement his accent when students couldn't always understand what he was saying. And so this is exemplified in this story that we have here. So he says, there was a final examination today, so not much communication between me and the students. One thing that happened was that a student wore a baseball cap. According to the exam guide, students can only wear a baseball cap backwards. So I told him, please reverse your hat. but the student did not understand me. I think he was a white native Canadian. I had to gesture reversing a hat to let him know. Okay, so I think in this narrative, Johnny positions himself as someone who can capably solve problems at work, right? So when the student didn't understand his instructions, right, Johnny found a quick way to make his point, right, to the student, and the situation was seemingly resolved after that. However, I think Johnny's use of gesture might signal, once again, an adherence to the racial linguistic ideologies that shape his relationship to the student in Canada. So we have to remember that Johnny chose to describe the student as a white native Canadian. And I think this really speaks to, Johnny's own insecurities of having to live and work in Canada. So Johnny often talked about how as an Asian speaker of English, he was often subject to this, racist perception of him being this automatically incoherent speaker of English because of his Asian background. So I think, like similar to Frederick, I think Johnny did sort of have this sort of internalized, internalized racist understanding of his own speech, and sort of recognizing that his speech can never be good enough, right? When heard by a white Canadian speaker who is on this, who's at the top of, this racial linguistic hierarchy in Canada, for example. So the point that I'm trying to say is that while gesture signals that Johnny views accent as irrelevant in getting his message across, his immediate need to use this tactic suggests that he would only repeat himself if he sounded, quote, more Canadian. So it's interesting that when the student first misunderstood Johnny, right, Johnny didn't try to repeat himself, right? Johnny just quickly went to using gesture, hand movement to, to make his point, right? So I think if Johnny felt more comfortable about his English, his accented English, would he have maybe felt more comfortable repeating himself over and over again until the student actually understood what he was saying, right? So that's just something we need to think about as well. Okay, so yes, I've talked for a lot. So I think I'm just going to wrap up now with some conclusions and implications of accent work. So I think, once again, contrary to professional actors and call center agents, ITAs don't really have to subscribe to a particular oral aesthetic in their accent work. So as we saw with all the examples I gave you, right, ITAs don't really need to sound one particular way in order to, do their jobs in terms of communication. But I think it's important to remember that for ITAs, accent work is simply about getting things done on the job, right? So I think if you talk to any ITA, right, when they do accent work, they're not thinking about these larger ramifications of what they do or not do with their accents, right? ITAs just really want to get their job done. They want to get paid. They want to just move on with their working lives, right? So I think if you talk to like my participants or any other ITA, if they talk about accent work, right, they're talking about accent work in a very, practical sense, right? They're not talking about it in terms of, once again, the larger sociological ramifications of what they're doing. But having said that, I don't want us to ignore, the other types of work inherent in accent work, right? So whether we think of accent as an action, a goal, whatever, I think we have to remember that an accent always does something in the context in which it's situated, right? So for me, I think an accent work always does ideological work, right? So even if we don't think of accent in terms of ideologies, right, what we're doing in our everyday lives in terms of our professional practices does, make this type of, it is sort of making some sort of ideological commentary about something. Yeah, so I think in terms of, ITA training, I think the discussion of ITA's accent work raises various questions on how we actually need to improve ITA training in universities. So I framed these questions, I framed possible suggestions in terms of questions that I just want to read for you, and then I'll just kind of, openly ponder about them. So the first question that I want to think about is, first, instead of changing the linguistic or pedagogical behaviors of ITAs, which is often the mandate of many types of ITA training programs, what if ITAs themselves play a role in conceptualizing what sounds right for their work? Right, so as we saw, with maybe engineering TAs, for example, engineering TAs don't really need to change all aspects of their accents, right? So if we're training ITs from engineering, why are we maybe focusing on, irrelevant things like maybe intonation patterns or rhythm or word stress, for example? maybe we just need to focus maybe on helping them improve, just segmental features of their pronunciation, because engineers, once again, aren't really interested in talking a lot, right? So these super segmental features of pronunciation aren't really going to become, issues in, daily communication for engineers, right? So we really want ITAs to play a role in sort of developing their own professional practices to suit their own, professional context. Second, does ITA language training have to focus on the accented voice? How can ITAs learn to draw on the full range of their communicative repertoires while teaching? So if, like we saw with a TA like Johnny, right, you don't always have to rely on your accent to communicate a point, right? You can use gesture, for example, and make your points intelligibly, right? So as you know, deaf scholars of language will have told us repeatedly, right? Communication is not speech communication. Communication can take the form of a variety of modalities, right? So why aren't we helping ITAs, sort of use the full extent of their communicative repertoires when they have sort of situations of miscommunication with students, right? Why can't they, sort of find other ways to communicate if accent is actually causing a very real communication problem at the moment? But having said that, I do want to emphasize the last question, which is how can ITA training curricula better incorporate critical sociolinguistic study and self-reflection? So with an ITA like Johnny, right, even though he uses gesture to communicate his point, right, like I suggested, I think gesture is also indicative of his own insecurity about his accent, right? So we have to allow ITAs to critically reflect on their professional practices. So why do they want to change or not change aspects of their accents, right? So I think we have to let ITAs sort of have these formal opportunities to really think about, the ramifications of what they're doing in their daily professional practices, and think more carefully about why they actually want to change or not change their accents. And then one final note that I want to make is that when we talk about accent work, this also speaks to needed changes in university practices and policies. Why are ITAs the ones who have to be responsible for intercultural communication, right? So I think communication is not this interpersonal individual issue. I think of communication as really a policy issue, right? And I think universities, right, in North America really uphold, one type of, white settler type of English as the standard for, oral communication. So I think we have to really change language policies and help, administrators, faculty, et cetera, really understand that, there are multiple ways to communicate which are all equally valid, and they're equally capable of, getting one's point across. So we just have to think more communication as, a policy issue rather than, an individual issue. And something that's, only the sole responsibility of ITAs, which is not. So I will stop rambling and just say, if you have any questions or comments for me, feel free to email me. And once again, if you're on Twitter, feel free to follow me, because I do tweet a lot about accents, and I'm much more coherent on Twitter than I am today. So other than that, yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any of your questions or comments if you have any. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Vijay. I see hands. So we have time for Q&A. If anyone has questions, I ask that you either type them in the chat or use the raise hand function, and then I'll call on you. So I will open it up to all of you. I'll start with, the person whose screen name is H. Data.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my full name is not on because I'm not signed on. My name is Hia. Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. That was an amazing presentation. I'm passionately interested in this topic, and I have many questions, but I'll just ask one so that everyone can ask questions. So you talked a lot about what the person with accent can do and how communication is whole. My background is the same as Dr. Ogler's. I'm actually a graduate of the GC speech and hearing program. So, I understand that part very much about total communication. What do you think the listeners can do on their end to make this more of a, middle ground for both parties? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think the thing about listening to that we have to remember that is that listening is not a technical skill. So I think we have to remember that we're listening with our whole bodies and we're listening with an ideological filter. So for listeners, I would say, like, if you're not understanding a certain type of accented speaker, is it really because of the actual acoustic quality of the accent, or are you making some sort of ideological judgment about the speaker at first glance? So I think we talk about, training for ITAs, but I think, like, even for like undergrad students, first year undergrad students, right? Why aren't we having, like listening workshops, for example, about like just how to understand basic questions? And I just want to clarify too, like when I say workshops, I'm not saying that workshops are going to solve, like racist and xenophobic perceptions of ITAs, but I think it's sort of sending a statement saying, that the communication is really a two-way street, right? And listeners have to do their part as well. So yeah, workshops are just like a small sort of statement. And we obviously need, wider, policy stuff, but yeah. Thank you for that, yeah.
We'll go to Olivia next and then Yiju.
Hi again. Oh, I wasn't sure if I was unmuted. Hi again, Vijay. Thank you for your talk. Actually, I was thinking pretty much the whole time, and I was happy that towards the end you brought in deaf scholars and a similar connection with the deaf community, which is what was in the back of my head, because my brother was born deaf. My parents didn't know he was deaf until he was 2 years old. He grew up wearing hearing aids, got cochlear implants at 18. So he always kind of had a similar struggle with his speech and being perceived by people who are hearing. And yeah, it just made me think of, and made me curious if you know of any similar work with people who are deaf in their communication with hearing people, and what that, if there's parallels there, which I feel like there might be, like in accommodating their speech to be accurately understood by hearing people. I just want to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question too. The only person that I think might have an answer is John Henner. And he's also on Twitter as well. So I know he is interested in accent, but in a different way, right? If there's such a thing as maybe like a so-called deaf accent, for example. So I think he's one person to look out for. I think I haven't read anything. Yeah, but look for his work, I think would be great.
Sure.
And I think
John Henner, can you?
Henner, yeah, maybe I can just write that.
Yeah, I'd be interested.
And he's on Twitter if you're on Twitter too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, sorry, there's no H in John Henner, right? I don't think. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yiju, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Vijay, for this great talk. I'm also doing an ethnographic work in the STEM discipline and examining the ITA interaction, socialization with the U.S. students, right? And then so I am framing this deficit view, constructing discursively the ITAs and also their accents from a native speakerism perspective, and also how the nature of STEM discourses can challenge the applied linguistic view about accent work. So I have some questions, but because the time constraint, so just two questions. So first question is, so in the United States, I know each state has its own state policies about ITA training, and that has been implemented in different level of university and college to have this kind of ITA training program. So I wonder, in Canada, do they have similar state policy and then implementation in university and college level? Because I think that relates to one of your questions. And then the second question is about your analysis. I found very interesting because I think the ITA from the different work background recognize or become aware of this linguistically and culturally diverse linguistic and cultural diversity issues or phenomena in the U.S. or in Northern American context. Can you say more about can you provide us more contextual information about for why the Friedrich or Johnny say about that, because I have a terrible accent, or I need to do the gesture in order to make my students who is a native white Canadian speaker to understand that my command asking him to wear the jackets like with the hats backward. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you so much, Yiju, for that, for those questions, and I'm very much interested in your research as well. Yeah, so with regard to the first question about Canadian policies for ITAs, I think in Canada we don't actually talk a lot about accent, and I think that's kind of I think it goes more to this idea of diversity too of universities, like this neoliberal diversity. Like it's sort of taboo to talk about accent, and as a result, a lot of universities don't really offer accent training or pronunciation training in the Canadian context. Like oftentimes in the Canadian context, we have more about like intercultural communication and this whole notion of Canadian academic culture, which is another problematic term, which deserves its own presentation. But yeah, so Canada is not like the US in the sense that, I know, yeah, like you mentioned, there are state laws saying, ITAs have to do like these mandatory, remedial pronunciation classes, before they can teach. But we don't have those types of laws in Canada, at least not to my knowledge at the moment. So, but yeah, there is one interesting counterexample, I would say, at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's not an ITA training program, but they do have an accent clinic for international students. And that brings in a whole another thing about, the medicalization of foreign accents, because this health clinic is operated by the speech language pathology department. So it is interesting, like what are we saying about foreign accents in that regard too, in terms of workplace training. So that's another dynamic that deserves another presentation. And then more contextual reasons why Frederick and Johnny sort of might have had those own perceptions of their accents. Yeah, so I think yeah, so like I said with Johnny, first of all, I think a lot of the themes of my interviews with Johnny was about him sort of having to deal with this perpetual foreigner stereotype that Asians experience in Canada and in the US, right? So I think even like even beyond the university, Johnny felt like, okay, just because they saw this Asian face, right? People, particularly white people, just thought like, okay, I can't understand what you have to say. So I think having to deal with these situations on a daily basis does have a toll, right? It does have a psychological toll on Asian ITAs or ITAs in general. So I think that's why when it came to discussing his professional practices, he did have that sort of, internalization of these racial linguistic ideologies. Frederick, yeah, is kind of the same way. I know Frederick was maybe more proud about his accent, right? He felt like he didn't want to change his accent, but I think once again, just being sort of the racial and linguistic outsider in his department and having to deal with all of these awkward situations on a repeated basis does get, does take a mental toll on you. And then maybe you come to maybe, internalize these perceptions. So yeah, thank you for that.
Lara?
Thank you, Vijay. That was great and a great presentation. It left me with a lot of ideas in mind to think about in the following days. But I have a comment and a related question, because the other day, and I'm trying to remember the reference to share it, but I cannot remember it, but I read about a study in which they gave students, a study they did with the students, university students, in which they let them listen to a lecture, and then they did a test on the lecture content to them. And they got exactly the same lecture, except for the picture of the professor who apparently was giving the lecture. It was the same age, the same gender, the same clothes, same positioning and everything. But one of them got a picture of an Asian professor and the other ones of a white professor. And the incredible result of this study is that the people who thought that the lecture was being given by an Asian professor had worse results in their understanding of the lecture, which was exactly the same lecture that the others got. So just to an example of how powerful racial linguistic ideologies are and how they actually are operating in colleges nowadays. And I was going to ask you, Vijay, if in this study you did some kind of also research about the students' thoughts on this and the students' like the students' opinions on these ITAs. And also thinking about the materiality of accent here, thinking about actually like how this might impact these ITAs' chances into the job market. Because, for example, now students' reviews are very important whenever you go to find a job. And there has been a lot of studies too. There have been a lot of studies too about how some racialized professors are getting lower and worse reviews in websites such as Rate My Professors. So I was wondering if you also ask students about their perceptions on those accents and on their understanding of the content because of that. And thank you again for the presentation.
Yes, so thank you so much, Laura, for those questions and comments. Yeah, so that study that you were talking about was from Donald Rubin, right, in 1992. Yeah, so that was an excellent example of how racial linguistic ideologies operate, right, in terms of individual perception. Actually, about the materiality of accent and like student evaluations and the academic job market, that is very interesting because the article that I'm writing for the special issue that you're editing will actually talk about that in more detail. But yeah, I think a lot of the ITAs did know that the whole concern about their accents wasn't really about the accent itself. It was really about them not physically and orally matching the ideal Canadian worker, right? And so that Crease and Cambere study I mentioned in the slides. I think for a lot of them, they felt like, accent was this unfair barrier placed upon them, right? And they felt like they had, the technical skills and knowledge to do their jobs, but because they did not have this so-called Canadian accent, they knew it was going to be 10 times harder to find a job in Canada. And so what was interesting too was that a lot of the engineers talked about that, right? And as I mentioned in my presentation, engineers had this sort of, very straightforward idea about language, something that could be sort of built and, constructed in particular ways. But for them, they felt like an accent was sort of this impenetrable barrier for them, right, outside of the university. So that's a very interesting point about, like how like once you get out of the university, how is your accent going to be perceived on the wider job market? In terms of like student evaluations too, I think, yeah, I don't think they talked a lot about how like their evaluations, like I don't think many of them were going to be like professors or academics. So they didn't really talk about student evaluations that much, I don't think, or at least I can't remember at this moment, but yeah. Thank you for
that. There's a question in the chat from Yanis. Why is it that non-native speakers have a more perceptive or receptive listening and understanding of accented English than native speakers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just like, the experience and being able, just having, constant interactions with people who don't understand you. I think they do sort of, realize, hey, like I need to be more, caring and more generous with my own listening practices, right? When it comes to, understanding different types of, accents. So I think, yeah, there's nothing, like genetically superior or some cognitive trait. I think it's just their lived experience as non-native speakers, right? And working in or living in contexts where they have to communicate with a variety of people, right? It's, it's going to.
Yeah. Do we have any neurolinguistics insights about language networks for native speakers and non-native speakers? Like what is has anybody studied that structure, and do they work differently? That's because that could explain why there is a this gradation in listening efficiency.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with like the neurolinguistic research, so I can't say exactly, but I mean that would be interesting to look at. But yeah, thank you for that.
We'll do Liz and then Lorraine.
Hi. I just wanted to kind of pick your brain. I'm coming at this from the perspective, I'm training to be a speech language pathologist right now. And I was assigned as a student clinician an accent reduction client. And he came to me and we were working on stuff and he seemed really excited to be working on his accent and everything. And I was just thinking throughout your talk, because like maybe he is coming at it from a, he has to sound a certain way to be accepted in our society, our North American society. But like I have learned foreign languages, like I learned French in school, and I worked really hard to sound native, like to do the correct pronunciation. And I felt like kind of the vibe I was getting from this whole talk is like, it's not okay to work on your pronunciation. You should be proud of your accent. You should, but I think it is okay to work hard on something and to try to sound more native, like if that's what you want. So I just wondered kind of what your perspective is on that. And yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Yes, I think I have to clarify, like, I am very critical about like accent reduction and pronunciation and teaching in general, because that's just like what I do. But I mean, I'm not saying that, not working on your pronunciation is never, it is okay to want to change your pronunciation, change your accent, right? But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that you shouldn't be institutionally forced to do so, right? And so I think and we have to understand our own positionality, right? So as maybe like, just say a white person learning, the right tones in Mandarin Chinese, for example, right? For their own, travel purposes, right? That's about, it's not about, trying to survive in the world. It's just for your own kind of, enjoyment in terms of travel, right? But for like the Chinese speaker of English in Canada, who's, finding it difficult to get a job because of their accent, right? Wanting to change your accent is really about, not being accepted by the society, right? So I think when we talk about pronunciation learning and language learning in general, we have to look at it beyond the immediate context of individual desires and see where are these desires coming from, right? Because oftentimes we just want to be accepted in our social surroundings, right? And sometimes our desires are informed by these wider ideologies that are in our society. So I think it is complicated to say the least, but I mean, yeah, I'm not saying that people should never want to change their accents. I'm just asking people to think more carefully about why are they doing so, and is it always necessary?
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I just know that there's been a big push in my field in speech pathology to maybe even eliminate they're calling it accent modification now, because accent reduction is a little, not a great term. But I feel like it should still be a service that's available if people want it, if not for cultural reasons, not because they can't get a job, not because, but they want to improve their pronunciation for personal reasons, so yeah, it's a line that I'm trying to walk, and I feel like I'm getting a lot of pushback from my field saying you can't want to do this with people, and I feel like I should be able to use my skills as a speech pathologist to help people who really legitimately just want to sound more native, like if that's something that it's not a social pressure to do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I do, yeah, because the whole notion of accent reduction, like I mentioned, is kind of ludicrous to begin with, because what does it actually mean to reduce an accent? So that's why I often talk about pronunciation teaching is actually the better term, because we don't want to change the entire accent, right, but improve specific features of pronunciation. Yeah, I'll stop because I have, yeah, lots of, yeah. I'm more critical about the whole thing, but I have some articles. I have an article I wrote about this. I might share it with you guys if you want to read more about it.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more. That's why I'm asking, is because I'm trying to be respectful of people who are, they really feel that this is a negative thing to be offering these services at all. And I just don't feel like that's a case in some situations. So that's why I'm trying to learn different perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I would say, yeah, it's not like a street, I don't want to say like, oh, you're wrong. I'm just trying to think, like we have to think more like all of the, complexities of the situation. Yeah. But thank you, Liz, for that.
Grain.
Hi, with respect to what Liz just said, I've heard the term now in speech language pathology, accent management, where it's assumed that you have your identity and it's associated with how you speak English, but you might want to acquire aspects of another variety that would help you in speaking respectfully such that more of your students can understand better. And that's the issue I wanted to raise. When I'm speaking to people who I expect, I realize how I modify my register has to do with the people I'm speaking to. I would talk differently to a linguist as compared to a non-linguist about, I use different lexicon, different syntax probably. When I'm talking to a group of older individuals, I make a point of not speaking too fast. And I would consider it insulting if someone said to me as an older person, I talk too fast. Just tell me if you have any problem here understanding what I say, because I know I talk too fast, rather than I'll try and speak slower, but please do ask if you have any questions. And if I'm speaking to a group I know is not likely to be speakers of my sort of English as native speakers, I also, my son told me it was great how slowly I spoke when he was listening to a lecture I gave in the Emirates, because he was able to get work done on his computer too. So that tells me I somehow naturally, or when I'm talking certainly to a person with brain damage who has aphasia, I will select lexicon and speech rate and maybe intonation, I don't know. So it feels to me like I'm being respectful by trying to be more easily understood. So of course I can see that it's problematic if people are judging me because I look old or because I'm a white woman. But I do think there's legitimate place for speech language pathologists and experimental linguists to consider what the challenges are for some, if not all, listeners to process speech with accents they're not familiar with. And maybe another thing those workshops could do is work on assigning films for people to watch, to move into becoming more familiar with a range of accents of the language they're going to be taught in. I did have one thing to say to Yanis, which is, at least I did a study, and I know there's a set of them, looking at the range of phonetics for voice onset time used by bilinguals who pass as native speakers in both languages as compared to non-native speakers. And the range is actually greater. So we have to assume that there's brain incorporation of one's ability to appreciate a further range. What I identify as an R is probably smaller than what a proficient Hebrew English speaker, French English speaker identifies in the R range because of my experience, my lesser experience with those two languages.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine, for that. I think, yeah, one thing I want to mention too, like when I talk about the need to learn to listen, like I don't want to sort of ignore the ableism in that statement too, because I do recognize that, people, it's hard for people, like you mentioned, to listen, right? There are these, they have, certain disabilities, you can't always, listen as intently as you want to. So yeah, I do recognize that. And then also one thing that that I thought about while you were speaking is just this whole idea about how accent, our perceptions of accent change depending on, the content of what we're speaking, the context in which we're situated, right? So if I know a lot about, engineering topics, for example, and someone with a so-called incomprehensible accent, is speaking quickly, right? Maybe I might not, pay much attention to the accent because I know about the topic already, and I don't need to really pay a lot of attention because I know what the person is generally talking about. So yeah, once again, we have to think about like how context really shapes perceptions of different people's accents. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
I can't remember whose hand was up first, but I think maybe Hia and then Yiju and then Jensen.
Thank you. I just want to speak a little bit to Liz's point and Dr. Obler's about the availability of services. I think, of course, that's important. I have a background in speech pathology too, so I totally welcome the services, but it is from, doing it from a perspective of choice, and also, services like what Vijay opened with the actors and, requiring different accent. I mean, that by far, that's something I think speech pathologists could train people to do. And, Dr. Rober mentioned the term accent management. I've heard another one from a colleague, accent extension, which means you get to keep your, you get to keep multiple accents. So although I don't sound completely American, this is something I've trained myself to speak in. I can switch and speak in an Indian accent. And I think I moved from that too, and I don't sound totally Indian when I do that. But at any rate, to be able to have the choice, I think, is key. And also, certain accents have higher status than others. So, for example, I think I've heard people have a lot of respect or, eulogize French accent. But I don't think that if I spoke like this to people and used my Indian accent with the hard does and does, as you're hearing, that's not considered romantic in any way. So, I think that also plays into this idea of, how much freedom one has when we talk about accent change in any way. And then the last thing I want to bring up is the ableism that you were saying, Vijay. With all of Dr. Ogler's example, there were certain barriers that were hard to cross. But if you take the speaker and the listener both to be able people, then both need to, move from where they are to be able to communicate better. So I appreciate her sort of talking to us about the listener's perspective.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for all the wonderful discussion and perspective. I'm very happy to listen to and also like expand my understanding and also about for example, the discipline of speech hearing pathology about the accent work. So I would like to add a little bit to Vijay's comment on the situated context and accent work for ITA. So you mentioned about the engineering and STEM discipline, right? And so one thing in my findings I found interesting because accent for the ITA scholars with international background, it's not that sensitive to them because what matters most to learn in their discipline is their knowledge of mathematics and all the scientific concepts surrounding their own research areas, right? So they care much more about how much math they know in order to perform their academic identity. That's one thing I learned. I also talked to their the dean of the college and also their senior engineering that working in, so for example, like a Boeing company. They say they will recruit people who can show them they are good at math, they are good at engineering. Their accents, that's okay. Communication, if they can understand in communication each other's point about STEM, that's fine. Yeah. So I think their perspective from STEM discipline is really something that we as applied linguists need to consider, that, and also to reconceptualize what accent work mean for us. And maybe because I'm not from the discipline of speech hearing pathology, but how we can bring their perspective and to reconsider that. So for example, the term that you just shared, the accent extension or accent management. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'll go. So thanks so much for that presentation, Vijay, and also I really like your Twitter. Okay, so my question is, in examples you use, from my recollection, the participants were visibly racialized and experienced some sort of personal tension and had internalized some of the logic of language ideologies, right? But I'm wondering, were any of the participants white, and they have to navigate these tensions that the visibly racialized participants, teachers had to?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for following me on Twitter. Yeah, so I did have, so there were actually 2 white TAs in my sample, but one of the TAs didn't complete the entire study, so I didn't include her in this study. But I'll just talk about the one who stayed on, and he was a white French TA actually, and he was in engineering as well. And so he did have somewhat similar experiences to like his racialized counterparts. So his students were mostly these so-called native English speakers as well. So they would sort of notice aspects of his accent or make fun of him. But what was different was that like they just thought of it as sort of like a kind of, silly thing. Like it wasn't like a big professional issue. Like he didn't feel like he needed it to, change his accent. And what was interesting too with that TA was that oftentimes they perceived him as French Canadian. They thought of him as this automatic Canadian because of, Quebec being one of our, the largest, French speaking province, right, in our country. So because of, his linguistic background and his phenotypical whiteness, right, he often felt like he was already a typical Canadian. So maybe students didn't really want to challenge him at the same time and say, hey, you're not a Canadian. You don't have a Canadian accent. Why I can't understand you. I think they sort of accepted him as a de facto Canadian. Yeah, so that was interesting, and that was the main difference that I would say between him and the other participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I maybe just say one thing, just following up on that? My reason for asking that question is because I've read some articles, particularly in different contexts in Asia, where backpackers have been able to really get jobs quite quickly, right? So these similar tensions that racialize, well, we're all racialized, but we're all differentially racialized, right? Experiences, it's quite different, right? So it speaks to the white centricity that's so pervasive, and it privileges those with white racialized bodies. So
yeah, that's a great point, because like my other research too, or my past research was about English language teaching, and just like basically if you're white and a so-called native speaker of English, you can basically get a job anywhere you want, right? And if you have the right passport as well, right? So if you come from Katru's inner circle countries, right, you basically are guaranteed a job. So that's interesting too, how accent, right? Yeah, well, that's another topic that I won't get into, but yeah, thank you for that observation.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much, Vijay, and thank you to everyone who asked really interesting questions and shared great references. I'll be sharing those references when I email out the recording. That we have one more socio lunch this semester in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for the information for that. And yes, please, if we were in person, I would say clap, but if you feel like clapping for real, you can. Otherwise, the Zoom claps are good. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate those Zoom claps. Thank you.